Hello everyone, it's your Professor Bruce Olszewski again, and today we're going to talk about environmental justice. So let's get on with it. Okay, so we're going to talk about some issues about the environment and the relationship to people. So the key thing to understand here is that when we affect the environment, of course, we affect ourselves. So when we transform natural resources into goods, inevitably there's going to be pollution, right? So when we dig up mountains, when we cut down trees, there's environmental impact. There's water runoff that carries soil and oftentimes toxics, and then those go downstream, and then that disrupts habitats. But it also affects the people who then rely on clean water and clean land, of course, and that would be all of us, right? Okay, so polluting the environment pollutes people. And the other thing that we know is that when we have more people, and of course we do because we've had exponential population growth. So just for an example, in my lifetime alone, the global population has more than doubled. So if you go from the beginning of time until the day I was born, there's one number of people, right? And then between when I was born and today, it's more than doubled. And so in a very short time frame. So that means exponential growth. This also means that as we have more people, we consume more things. And as we consume more things, that means we require more resources. When we require more resources, we extract more resources from the environment. And then that requires more energy resources to do that, and both of those things mean more impacts. There's more environmental impacts from processing or collecting resources than processing resources, and all of that means more negative environmental impacts. And so, there's oftentimes talk about individuals and this big focus on individuals about, there's this pressure, that some people feel about then consuming less and doing things to improve the environment. We never really improve the environment. The only thing that individuals can do is have less impact on the environment, right? So to a large degree, what individuals do is really an expression of personal ethic rather than impact, right? There's been reports that essentially there's like 90 companies that create the great majority of greenhouse gases, for example. So my point is that the action of a company influences thousands of individuals because one company produces a good. And after all, you and I, we think of ourselves as important individuals, but to industry, we're nothing more than a consumer, right? You're a consumer, I'm a consumer. When you and I are talking, I'm a professor, you're a student, but when we go to the store, we're the same, we're consumers, right? So everyone's a consumer, but the impacts are really created by the industries that make those products and how they choose to do it, and if they are regulated in how and the quantity of impacts that they create. So really, this stuff about environmentalism is not about the old saying of save the whales, or because you're trying to do something to save the environment or have a greater personal ethic that expressed in reducing negative impacts. Because you're really not saving the environment. It's important, it's valuable, there's no doubt about that, but what we're really trying to do is to take action to save the people, right? We're trying to have respect for generations that come after us. So when we say things like, and you hear political people saying that they love their country, and we hear parents and family members talk about they love their families, and I say that if we really do, then we would do things institutionally to provide for the sustainability of the environment, because it's the environment that sustains all life all life. That means humans as well as all the natural resources that are out there that provide for us and that naturally recycle things, right? Okay, so you mean things like, air and water and stuff like that. All right, so that's enough of that. You get the idea that ecological footprints impact people and the environment. So here's an example. This is something that I use in my Introduction to Environmental Issues course, and I use it in my recycling class, Environmental Studies 148, and maybe I will see you there. I hope I do. So what this diagram shows is the extraction of resources. You have mining, and then the processing of resources that have to be transported and purified and manufactured, and then ultimately we use things, and then all things ultimately are discarded. So you see that there's environmental effects with each one of these steps, and all of these are negative environmental impacts. So one of the things we look to do is how do we reduce those impacts, and we often, and I do this all the time, talk about how do we reduce the impacts on the environment, but we have to consider what are the impacts on people who live near processing facilities, whose land it is where resources are extracted. So what about the rights of the people who are mostly impacted by the processing and consumption and discard of resources? So the environment then is where, of course, we live, the air we breathe, neighborhoods where food is grown, where we swim or fish or get drinking water from. It's where our resources from. So again, environmental issues are not limited to the threats to animal and plant species. It's a misnomer when we say we act because it's good for the environment, because anything we do impacts the environment, but it also impacts the people, right, who process those things. So when we strive to make fewer negative environmental impacts, we do that because of our love of families and the environment, which supports current and future generations. When the environment isn't sustainable, nothing is. Now, I don't know, maybe I'll see those quotes somewhere that some professor said that. That would be me. Okay, so how do we then consider these impacts as well as the people who process these things and who are mostly impacted? Well, we have the Earth life support systems. This is what we rely on, of course, right, in the most basic, simplest way. And the influence here is the human, let's call it the culture sphere. So it's the population, which I said has been growing, and then you have politics and economics, and these things are all influenced by worldviews and ethics. So you'll have some people that are more concerned about consuming for right now and about the economy for right now, and they don't want things to change even though there are negative impacts to people and the environment. So for example, carbon-based fuels. There's a lot of people and many political people that want to continue using oil and coal. The reality is that those things, when they're combusted, create negative environmental impacts: acid rain, air pollution, greenhouse gases, particulates, on and on and on. And there's also impacts to people who live near these, where coal is mined, where there are dams that hold all the coal ash after it's burned, and the acidic waters and what have you. So politics plays a huge role in this, and it's and because you have politics will fight for one side or the other. Okay, so you get the idea here. So it's the cultural systems here that are very important in making decisions about what the output's going to be here. So you have human capital and natural capital that come in. We make decisions how to process these things and how we consume these things. We make decisions on laws, regulations, and things like human rights, right? And the outputs are goods and services, the things that we sell and buy and consume, heat. There's always, because energy always goes from high quality to low quality, simply meaning that energy can never be improved in quality. It always declines. And then we have depletion of the non-renewable resources. So those are things that don't continue to grow, like minerals, right? And then the degradation of renewable resources. And here's where our key problem is, because this is what we're doing, is degrading renewable sources. It's kind of like if you have a large inheritance and you're living off the money from it, it would be best to, of course, to live off the interest, because then you have a sustainable source of money. But if you spend all of the interest that's generated plus some of the capital, meaning the fundamental money, you'll run out, right? So sustainability is the key here. All right. So, and as I had said, that populations are increasing, so there's more consumption. And we know that with globalization, we're improving the quality of life of many people who live in poverty, right? We know that the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 has put hundreds of thousands and probably millions more into poverty. There's about 300,000 have moved into deeper levels of poverty in India, for example. But with globalization and the trading of goods, there's in general more consumption. And how do we know all this? Because there's a rising gross domestic product of the world. The global GDP is going up. So that means more value, more goods, more consumption. But what this shows you, this is called the IPAT, IPAT. So you have the impact of a population is determined by the size of the population, the consumption or the affluence of a society, how much stuff they consume, and the technological impact per unit of consumption. And what that means is that if you have production techniques that use less material, that create fewer pollutants, then that technology means that we make things cleaner. So, for example, we've been talking about packaging and many other things, but when there's less packaging and it's recyclable, then there's less technological negative impacts. Okay? So it should be clear that in developed countries like the United States, like most of Europe, we have greater environmental impacts because of the things that we consume. We tend to live in bigger houses and consume more stuff and throw away more stuff, right? Okay, so that's the point here. So we've got this system with high quality energy coming in that is used to process matter, and then we have mostly an unsustainable high waste economy, and when we throw stuff away, we throw away the energy. So my point is that as we do all this, we have greater impacts on those people that process those things and live in those areas where those resources come from. And then what we need to be doing is go into a sustainable low waste economy where you take energy and matter that go into the system that processes materials, and simply then, as you have after consumption and discards, we recycle those things so that you actually create new jobs and new technologies that recycle the oftentimes renewable resources like wood and paper into other things, and then all the other non-renewable resources like metals. And we have pollution control, of course, but there's always going to be some waste. There's always going to be, energy always goes from high quality to low quality. So the key with that, of course, is, moving towards sustainable energy resources, renewables. Okay, so the idea here is that we create more jobs, have less negative impacts, and that we respect the rights of future generations. So this path then to sustainability means that we take natural capital. We know that we'll degrade it as we process stuff, but we start to apply some solutions. We know that it's not going to be perfect. And then the key thing here is that individuals matter. So that means the application of rights, human rights to people. I believe earlier I showed you a copy of the Human Rights Declaration from the United Nations. It was interesting that Eleanor Roosevelt was very much behind that. But that was a statement about how we need to respect the rights of everyone. So if we're going to create these solutions, we have to identify and act on responsibilities and then make those things actually effective as opposed to just words. So what's the role of the individual to make this happen? Well, we know that individuals are often fickle. Behaviors change, attitudes change. They may say one thing in public, do another thing in private. But individuals live in the society in which they work and live, and they're going to be, and that society is shaped by industry and government. So let's talk about industry. Government or industry will respond to legislation that comes from government and the accompanying regulation. But mostly what they want to do is avoid those things. They want to avoid legs and regs, right? So it's important to understand, and many people don't understand, that legislation comes first, and that essentially authorizes regulators to implement the legislation. And of course, when there's arguments, ultimately that goes to the courts where they make decisions. But the key element, of course, what industry does is that it responds to market conditions. So, for example, if government requires recycling or less production of waste, so we talked about the green dot, the Der Punkt, in Germany about packaging, and when they made the industry responsible for packaging, the industry responded by reducing, number one, the quantity of packaging used for materials and increased its recycling of those products. So they responded to the market condition that was created by legislation that ended up reducing the negative impacts. So the role of government then is to consider the ethics of a society, because it's people get elected based on those ethics and their awareness of it, and then what they want to be applied to a society. And you can't believe that people will mostly act in the best interest, because frankly they don't. Because if we did, we'd be much further along in respecting human rights and reducing negative environmental impacts on people and things. So we would reduce exploitation, but we haven't got to that point yet. And you can see that in things like when Joe Biden was elected over Trump. Trump still had 70 million people voting for him, despite his I would say he ranks right up there with the worst, one of the worst, if not the absolute worst environmental president ever to be elected to that office. And so it's legislation that enables people like him to support that legislation, which then a Republican Senate was pushing through and getting up to him. So it's important really to recognize the importance of a society to elect people. So where does exposure to environmental impacts happen? Well, it's no surprise here. Extraction of resources, mining and forestry, and the conversion of forest for things like cattle. We're losing the tropical rainforest for cattle grazing, mostly because they'll take that cattle and then sell it, export it to the MDCs, more developed countries. So there's processing, the impacts from transportation, which we've already covered, air pollution, water pollution, people live near ports. And then there's a loss of habitats where are homes of indigenous people. That means people who live in an area. Think of it this way: if a bulldozer comes down your street and starts tearing out houses in order to provide different type of housing, because or they want to plant crops or dig up mineral resources under your house, where do you go and live? And particularly if you weren't asked if you could be part of a decision-making process if your neighborhood should be raised in order to drill for oil. Okay, so that's just a metaphor. Okay, and then lastly, there's impacts from things like at the end of life of products, landfills and incinerators. Although incineration, burning garbage, is very rare in the United States, and I never recommend it. I think it's an incredibly bad idea. But nonetheless, products ultimately are discarded, and they end up in one of these two systems. And when they do, then we have air emissions and water pollution and odors. It's interesting that recently California adopted legislation about that requires cities to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that come from landfills. So there's legislation about collecting food waste, for example. But the point there is that impacts people who live near those areas. So the fundamentals of environmental justice is that there's institutionalized racism, and that could be intentional and it can be unintentional, right? So I don't want to just sit here and say that, racism is institutionalized. I want to tell you that sometimes that can be purposeful and sometimes it's not. You can have then government policies and political people and the people who work within government who might be aware of these things, but they're unresponsive. They haven't done anything to make a change to reduce these impacts. So the next part here of this problem is that the lack of resources and power in affected communities. I don't mean power like energy power. I mean the power of politics, that they tend to lack influence within elected bodies in democratic areas. You got to remember, much of the world is not run like a democracy. And then there's this problem here of commodification of land and water and energy. So really what that gets into this whole area of well, who should really own some of these things? Now, I'm not arguing for socialism or communism. I'm just pointing out that that's where we need more regulations to protect us from what others may do. So you can have land that is then plowed, and then soil runs off, and then that contaminates your land. We actually have laws that protect us from that. But I'm just trying to point out that ownership is important. And if you can't have ownership, then there's regulation. So environmental justice defends people who can't defend themselves, primarily people who are low income, disenfranchised. So that means the ones who don't have access to power. They tend to be undereducated. They don't have as much education as people do in more affluent neighborhoods and areas. And environmental justice will defend people whose lives or way of life is threatened or damaged or taken away, and then it works to defend children who have no power because they're not of voting age, so they're often not considered by political people. I mean, and some of this, you might even think that, well, one of the problems of a democracy is how elections are run, and elections are run by controlled by money. How much money can you get? And so these areas typically don't have a lot of money to provide to a politician to help them buy the resources to influence people to vote for them. So this is another key problem. So, what's meant by environmental justice is to be fair and to have fair and moral treatment for everyone, that everyone has a fair chance at living the healthiest life possible, and that there all of us should have our civil rights maintained, and have everyone be aware of the legal protections. Now, you might think that that's obvious, but I can tell you that there have been political maneuvers to actually disenfranchise people. There's a lot of that happened in 2020, trying to keep people from voting, not allowing, well, it goes on and on. I'm not going to get into all those levels of detail, but it's a very serious problem. And then here is also with environmental justice is to allow people to be free from exploitation by having more pollution where they live, because they don't speak up, because they don't have power. So environmental justice will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, when everyone has equal access to the decision-making processes, to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, work, and thrive. The key to that is, and taking a line from that musical Hamilton, is to be in the room where it happens. And I can tell you from myself, having been in hundreds of government meetings, that often people don't know how the process works and they don't know where to be influential. And I can tell you, you are almost never influential when you go to a city council meeting, because most of those decisions are made at a committee level. And so you have to know that, and you have to be able to go to the committees where you can actually shape legislation, which I've done a few times. And so it's important, it's absolutely critically important that you understand that, is to be in the room where it happens, where the decisions are being made. Okay, and frankly, I don't think we do enough education of that, particularly of those people who are exploited. We don't know how the process works and how to influence it. So there's been action that's been taken. Here's something from in Europe, where they were defining environmental justice, and they're saying that it's a condition of environmental justice exists when environmental risk and hazards and the investments and benefits are equally distributed with a lack of discrimination, whether direct or indirect, at any jurisdictional level, and when access to environmental investments, benefits, and natural resources are equally distributed, and when access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental related matters are enjoyed by all. Okay, so let's get a little closer to the United States. So this is from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Environmental justice is two things: one, fair treatment, and two, meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And I want to tell you something. What's really, to me, what's critical in here is this element of income, because I've looked at some things about other things about human rights and where our rights are, and oftentimes it'll talk about race, creed, color, sexual orientation, but I've not seen in those things income. So there's oftentimes discrimination based on somebody's level of affluence. So people that tend to have more affluence get more rights than people who have, you can have discrimination based on class. So it's classism, right? Okay, so what's great about this with the Environmental Protection Agency is that they include this income part. So fair treatment is defined here, as is meaningful involvement. Fair treatment simply means that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, and commercial operations or policies. I think that reads really well. Secondly, as meaningful involvement. What that means is that people have an opportunity to participate in decisions about activities that may affect their environment and or health. So that's when you get notifications, right? And you can often go to many government websites and click on some things, so you'll be notified of meetings and considerations of things. So I get those all the time from many, from like Cal Recycle, for example, the county that I do a lot of work with, and the city of San Jose where I live. So public's contribution can influence the regulatory agency's decision-making process, how they write the rules, how they write the regulations. So community concerns can be considered in the decision-making process, and that decision makers can seek out and facilitate involvement of those potentially affected. So what's critical about that, for example, is when there's going to be some construction in an area, or building a dam or building a building, and that there's requirements that there be notification, right, of people who may be influenced. Something as simple as that is extraordinarily important. So I want to point out that exploitation isn't new. We saw a lot of action happening in 2020 about things like the Black Lives Matter movement, the BLM movement, and it's important to recognize that many elements of exploitation, they're not new in this decade. They were not new in the 60s when we had the same type of thing. We had race riots going on. But you can go all the way back to colonialism, and probably back further than that. So that's where I'm going to start. So colonialism is really the physical control of one country over another or a region. So it's a policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country. And sorry about that. Colonialism is, sorry, I didn't mean to click off of that, is occupying land with settlers or exploiting it economically. So that's happening. For decades, there's been this argument in Israel, for example, about the Golan Heights, and other countries who then control other areas, but Israel is just an example of that. And then there's direct military and political control, where you just roll in your army to take over something, like what Russia did in an area of the Crimea Peninsula in the Ukraine. They just moved in and took it. That was also in the 2000, when was that? About 2015, something like that. Okay, so neocolonialism, which is also known as economic colonialism, is when we don't have physical control, but you use economics and the influences of globalization to control a country and its people. And so it's a cultural imperialism. And they provide things like conditional aid. We loan you this money if you do this. So, for example, we'll give you this money if you extract these resources. And I'll give you some examples of that. So the difference is that neocolonialism typically results in a relationship of dependence or subservience or financial obligation towards the neo-colonist nation. And it can result in undue degrees of political control and debt obligations, and it functionally imitates the relationship of traditional colonialism. And oftentimes what happens here is money that goes into key people who are mostly influential and mostly powerful. So you see some countries that have essentially like dictators who get most of the resources, but it doesn't go to the people. Okay, so countries that have been under the influence of Europe, you should know this from your high school education. You can see with these colors where this control's been. So most of it's come out of Europe, right? And so when they look at a place like Africa, Right? It's interesting to know that Africa was basically carved up for by the Europeans, right? And why? Because they look at these resources that they can extract and provide to the European nations. So this essentially happened in South America as well. You can look at the history of South America, and you look at the conquerors like Pizarro and Cortez. They were there to basically to extract gold and then get it to Spain. So it gets much more involved, but that's an example. So, then it was, physical control, and now it's the bankers, it's the money that has the control. And you have the West then, Europe, that is controlling much of these areas, and you have countries then that are trying to break out of colonialism. So I want to give you a couple of examples because all this relates to environmental justice. So China began investing in the Sudan, primarily because China is near the Sudan, and China wanted oil because they needed oil for energy. And so bilateral trade began, and the trade level went from $103 million in the 90s to over or nearly $10 billion by the year 2007. And China then became Sudan's largest trading partner. And what's critical in all this is that in 2001, China joins the WTO. So that meant China began massively growing its economy, and it was primarily because it was selling massive amounts of products. So it needed resources to manufacture those products and energy to do so. So China's investment in Sudan directly impacts the economic prospects of the country because its revenues were rising exponentially. And so that's about a 700% increase. And China's currently the largest trading partner. So that just kind of sets the stage, right? So China was supporting the government that's in Khartoum, and they began this mutually dependent relationship primarily around oil, but not just oil. There were also resources that China wanted, particularly some of them that were critical for making electronics. So Sudan provides about 6% of China's oil, and China buys 60% of the oil that comes out of Sudan. So China then, to secure this flow of their resources and this relationship, China sold tens of millions of dollars worth of weapons to the Sudanese government. And then those weapons were used to assault civilians in the region. And then China was criticized for this role and what they were essentially enabling. Yeah, and the United Nations wanted to take action, but China could veto the actions that were being considered by the United Nations Security Council. And so we ended up with this, that China, as you can see in this cartoon, China's producing the arms that was used by, and I'll point out that was a group called the Janjaweed, to then actually begin a program of genocide in Darfur. So here's the ultimate environmental justice transgression. So with Chinese arms, the Sudanese government then employed the Janjaweed militia as a counterinsurgency force, and the Janjaweed killed between 200 and 400,000 civilians. That's about like half of the population of San Jose. Maybe probably more like 40%. In October of 2007, the United States declared that these killings in Darfur are to be genocide, and the UN Security Council wanted the Janjaweed to be disarmed And by 2008, the International Criminal Court had filed genocide charges against the Sudanese president, who was accused of masterminding attempts to essentially wipe out the entire tribes that were against him in Darfur with a campaign of murder and rape and deportation. Rape was being used as a form of intimidation so that others would comply. And ultimately, in 2019, after about 30 years in power, the leader of Sudan, this President al-Bashir, was overthrown in a military coup. And China, which was once his staunchest supporter, supported new leadership, as they said, to ensure stability. So I'm trying to point out to you that genocide was actually used by, supported by China, so that it can continue to get its resources, and that is the ultimate form of a transgression, an environmental justice transgression. So let's talk about something else, right, that's not so gruesome as genocide. But this is essentially genocide for species. So in forestry, let's just talk a little bit about the importance. Forests contribute about 1/6 of global carbon emissions when they are cleared. So it's kind of like carving out your lungs, right? When we go and we cut down forests in the tropics, we are surgically removing the lungs of the earth, and when we do that, we actually create more pollutants. So it's important to maintain them and the people who live within them, right? Because these forests have the potential to absorb about 1/10 of the global carbon emissions that come into the environment. And I'm showing you this picture of cows because much of the land is cleared to produce, is burned to provide land for cattle, which could then be exported to MDCs. So the causes of deforestation, of course, the driver is population growth and a rising gross domestic product. More money, more consumption, right? And so many of these lands are being turned into farms, primarily for soy and palm oil. And then there's cattle ranching, and then there's lumber operations for things like lumber, fuel wood, and assorted paper products. And then there's roads that are built into them, and urban infrastructure, and the whole concept of converting these natural areas into areas where products can be extracted and resources can be extracted that essentially go from LDCs, lesser developed countries, to the more developed countries. So this just shows you the road comes in, which the clearing happens, cattle come in, we lose these species, whether they be plant or animal. So as areas of tropical forests are destroyed or degraded, tribal groups are forced to change their resource base. They have to move. They can move into areas that are occupied by other groups, and then that strains area resources. So that then causes a tragedy of the commons, a fundamental environmental theory. They then convert from subsistence living, means living off what they can find in these lands, to becoming part of the capitalist system of growing crops for exports. And of course, the key crops for exports around the world, still to this day, is coffee, sugar, and tea, right? Not really food crops, but things that will generate more income. So rarely are rights of the people who live on these lands and are removed from these lands are recognized. And so there are millions of people who live in these tropical forests, and there's about 3.5 million square miles of these forests in about 70 countries. And 80% of these forests are in Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Gabon, Indonesia, Malaysia, Peru, Venezuela, and Zaire. So, each of these countries then would need to take action or companies that do work in those countries could adopt their own set of rules and regulations. And one of those things, of course, would be fair trade products, right? Which we've discussed a bit, the importance of having fair trade. So other countries have other lands of value, but they have to be managed effectively and respecting the rights of people who live within them. So there's an organization called the Forest Stewardship Council, and I remember a lot of discussion about them when there's a lot of pressure by individuals on the Home Depot because they were a major retailer of wood and wood products. So there's a lot of pressure on Home Depot to do something about this, and there was a group called the Forest Stewardship Council, and so they met with them. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Forest Stewardship Council, which does things to protect the environment and therefore have fewer negative impacts on people who live in forest. So the FSC is an international organization, and it provides a system of voluntary accreditation and independent third-party certification. So that means if you have a forest land, you could volunteer to adhere to their requirements, and the audits that would come in would come from not necessarily just the Forest Stewardship Council, but another party. So it's kind of like how the International Organization of Standards operates, the ISO, which we've also discussed. So the certificate holders can then market their products and services as the result of an environmentally appropriate, socially benefit, and economically viable forest management. In other words, they can market their products as FSC certified, and then individuals, people who buy those products, can feel more confident that there was greater levels of were taken to reduce or eliminate exploitation of the environment and people. So it confirms that the forest has been managed in a way that preserves biological diversity and benefits the lives of local people and workers, while ensuring that that area maintains its economic viability. So there are 10 principles, and I'm not going to read each of them, but I've put them here on this PowerPoint so that you can look at them at your leisure. But I can tell you the headlines, which are: the first principle is compliance with laws. The second is about workers' rights and worker employment conditions. The third is about indigenous people's rights. The fourth is community relations. The fifth is about benefits from the forest. Number 6 is environmental values and impact. Number 7 is about how management does its planning. 8 is monitoring and assessment. 9 is the conservation values and maintaining them. And the 10th is implementation of management activities. So you can see all this on their website, it looks like this. It's where they have everything in a downloadable document. Now we're going to talk a little bit about air pollution and impacts that are more local. So when people are influenced by air pollution, they get a variety of health problems that you can see here. So there are things like, irritation of eyes and nose and throat, but there's also impacts on the respiratory system, which can lead to things like cardiovascular diseases and cancers. So, for example, here's an area in our own country, in Louisiana. There's this area on this Louisiana, the Mississippi River corridor, that runs from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, as they say. And here's a map that shows the area here. I've been out here, but perhaps you have. And so some people will call this the Chemical Corridor or Cancer Alley. I watched a movie called Bernie. It's kind of funny. And they were referred to this area as the carcinogenic coast. So people nearby experience asthma, miscarriages, more neurological diseases and cancer than people that live in other areas. And so here is this environmental justice issue. And this area mostly produces plastics and will probably be producing even more as the oil industry starts moving away from, has no choice to move away from oil being used to produce gasoline, but using oil to produce products, and those products would mean primarily more plastics. So some areas have become so polluted that companies were forced to come in and actually buy the land and remove entire towns. But residents continually battle state government and chemical producers. Government, of course, is influenced by whoever gets elected to run it, and so you have a lot of economic interests that are fighting for their beliefs, and in doing that, it ends up having fewer, or trying to protect them from not being liable for the impacts they create on people. So we'll move on to another about water pollution, for example. So you have people that live near areas of water that can be polluted, and then they get polluted. So you have point and non-point sources of pollution, and these can be very difficult to manage, but the key with this is like who pays for managing this water pollutants. So when you have an area like, or a country like the United States, it's lawyers that pursue this to determine who's actually responsible, and the idea is to protect people who are exposed to this. Another type of exposure with landfills, when we throw stuff away, there's pollution. So there's 4 components to a landfill. There's the liner, a leachate collection system, there's the cover. This is in the United States, by the way. This is not the same in other countries. And then the area which it's situated. So the problem is that you get leachate, and leachate essentially, let's just call it garbage juice. When you put all kinds of garbage together, and then you create this toxic soup of food waste, liquid things, chemicals, so you never know what the heck it's going to be. But it is extraordinarily toxic, or can be. And then all landfills will eventually leak, although we build them to try not to. More recently, we have better techniques. So leaks contaminate groundwater. People who live near those areas then end up drinking contaminated groundwater. Like people who live near polluted rivers and streams, they're consuming contaminated water. And then these also become a nuisance for vectors like rats that come in, and then you're living near where there's odors, and it becomes a litter source. Odors, for example, in our county, there's the landfill called Newbie Island, which is off of Highway 880 near Milpitas, and there's a group of people out there who are putting a lot of pressure on local government to do something about the odors which they claim come from that landfill. Those odors, they may very well come from the landfill, but not far from there is also sewage treatment plants. There's one in Sunnyvale, of course the one for San Jose, and all of these things produce odors that can then move into other areas. So you have poorer air. You don't see rich neighborhoods next to sewage treatment plants and landfills. That's kind of my point there. So, and why is that? Because you have people that fight for it, and that's the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard. So it's a phenomenon where residents claim that a development is inappropriate for their local area, about housing, for example, or like I said, landfills and sewage treatment plants. And they'll protest development, that it's not appropriate, it should be located elsewhere. And the richer, more affluent people can usually force waste, noise, pollution generating activities away from their neighborhoods to less affluent communities. So examples of this is like Highway 85. If you get on your car and drive on Highway 85 and you drive through Saratoga, you probably haven't noticed, but I want you to notice the next time you go through there that that highway is actually sunken. It's dug down into the area, and that was because people in that area were concerned about noise, and so it ended up costing millions more dollars to lower that area, yet lower the road in that area. Yet if you go on Highway 85 where it meets Highway 87, you'll see that there's none of that whatsoever. In fact, there's these large flyovers, and so people who live in that area have to deal with more noise and more air pollution that comes from that area. So there was another environmental justice issue. So you had money that was taken away and used for the richer area that, of course, we all ended up paying to benefit. Another example of this, there had been a plan to build a waste-to-energy facility in the Los Altos Hills in our county that was ultimately shut down, or it never happened because lawyers in that area absolutely did not want garbage trucks running through their neighborhoods on a continuous basis to go to a facility that burned garbage that would then create toxic emissions. So it failed, and then that helped actually contribute to our system of recycling in all of California. We have a requirement that half of all the waste in California be recycled. So another issue of environmental justice is areas around ports. People live near ports, and we've covered this in the transportation lecture about particulate pollution and health problems, cancer rates. So Alameda County, they have a map of well, that should not be there. Here's asthmas in that area, and it's mostly along transportation routes, and another map of the LA area if you're from that area and you want to spend more time. So the idea is that we can use concepts of environmental justice to protect primarily its children, right, and as well as everyone else from air pollutants and chemicals, so that they can enjoy their lives. When we think about, again, the sustainability of the planet for the next generation and the generation after them and the generation after them. So how do we do all this? So we have to internalize externalities of production. So the externalities of production is that you make something and then you create a pollutant, but you don't have to pay for it. So the pollutant just goes into a neighborhood or in an environment. So that would be toxics and hazardous waste and solid waste, garbage. And how can we do that? Through the improved recycling of the materials and waste reduction techniques. So that would include things we've talked about, like extended producer responsibility, that producers would be responsible for taking back the products that they make. When they do that, then they reduce the toxicity in products. They make that product more recyclable because they want to keep their costs down, and the only language they understand is money, right? They can talk about anything else, but when you force them, when it relates to money, that's when they act. So other elements are the DSD. So that was the Dual System Deutschland, where Germany then required more recycling of packaging. DFE is designed for the environment, where you're making products less toxic, more recyclable. And DFD is designed for disposal, which basically is the same thing as DFE, making that product, designing products so that they can be recycled at end of life. So another solution with all of this is to include environmental justice principles in trade agreements. So that went in with the WTO, NAFTA that we've talked about, and there are many more. And you may find yourself in a situation where you're working for a company where you're going to have to be arguing for environmental justice principles because your company is involved in global trade. And then companies just simply choosing to self-regulate, and many of them have through things like the ISO, the International Organization of Standards, which we also talk about in this course. So, there's a lot of words that are said, such as these things here about being positive and hoping for the best, but nothing happens until there's action taken. And that's the key thing I want you to understand, is that a protest is not going to be enough. You have to be in the room where it happens. Okay, there we go. That's the end of this lecture on environmental justice, and hope you have a great day. All right, take care now.